Expedition into Perdition by the Innsmouth store, your place for Lovecraftian apparel, sticker, wall art and much more. Link to the shop in the description. A story from the Lovecraftian world.
All rights reserved. Reproduction, even in part, is not permitted. No part of this work may be reproduced, duplicated, or distributed in any form without the written permission of the author. This includes, in particular, electronic or other reproduction, translation, distribution, and public dissemination.
Preface. Most of the individuals mentioned in this story are purely fictional. The character depiction of Karl Koldewey, of the Second German North Polar Expedition, does not align with historical facts and is entirely fictitious. Additionally, the cultural descriptions of the indigenous people of Greenland are incomplete, and in the case of the so-called Northeast Greenlanders, entirely invented. At this juncture, the author expresses utmost respect for the Kalaaleet and all other indigenous peoples. This story is a work of fiction that merely incorporates some facts, such as the unresolved fate of the so-called Northeast Greenlanders, into the Cthulhu mythos created by the writer Howard Phillips Lovecraft.
In the icy expanses, cold and still, lies Lomar, the land of fear and magic, where darkness devours the days, and Amersac lies in the shadows.
Chapter 1, Studies of Professor Webb. It was not easy to persuade the eccentric yet principled Drive Armitage, head of the University Library at Miskatonic University in Arkham, to grant Professor William Channing Webb access to the securely locked Necronomicon. For some years, the Princeton University anthropology professor had been engrossed in legends mentioned in various ancient suppressed and forbidden writings, manuscripts, and records. The young scholar was fascinated by the frequent mention of names he had never encountered before. Undescribed places and civilizations in polar regions such as Lomar and Hyperborea, according to these often fragmentary writings, predated any known human high culture. The prospect of conducting groundbreaking research that could rewrite the cultural history of humanity spurred the professor on. Webb did not know much, and what he knew did not offer much help. Thus, he grappled for months with the university administration and, most of all, the obstinate Armitage, who preferred not to make the book available to anyone. As a librarian, he was naturally against the destruction of writings, but some should remain inaccessible to the public. The mentioned Necronomicon, authored by a mysterious 8th century Arabian scholar named Abdul al-Hazred, was known to only a few and carried a peculiar aura of evil and prohibition. Professor Webb, a child of the second half of the 19th century, dismissed such mystifications. His motivation was more rational and not of a religious or fanatical nature. He pursued the mentions in the old records deductively and meticulously, like a true man of science. Upon arriving in Arkham, Webb introduced himself to the grumpy-looking librarian. Upon arriving in Arkham, Webb introduced himself to the grumpy-looking librarian.
Let's be clear. I permit you to glance into the book only because I must. If it were up to me.
Webb cut him off.
I need only a few hours with the accursed book, and then I'll leave.
The still dissatisfied Armitage reluctantly led the visitor into a separate, antiquated room lined with bookshelves, equipped for necessary book research. Armitage locked the door behind himself and the visitor, justifying it with the value of the work the guest wished to consult. Then the librarian disappeared into an adjoining room. A while later, he returned with an old, tattered, leather-bound book. This was the legendary Necronomicon.
We possess one of the Spanish editions from the 17th century,
remarked Armitage as he delicately and reverently placed the old book on the desk.
The university administration has granted you 3 days, 9 hours each, with the book.
Armitage unpacked some tools he brought along and opened the chewed-up ham. He flatly refused to assist the visitor in deciphering the ancient Latin, claiming,
"I will not help you lose your mind."
Webb now noticed that the ill-tempered bookworm never mentioned the Necronomicon by name. Was he perhaps afraid of the book or what was written in it? Although the visiting professor made the most of his time, the results were meager. With his long-forgotten Latin skills, he could only extract fragments from the strange narrative and writing style of the book. Webb ignored some drawings, notes, and annotations that previous readers had scribbled into the book, deeming them insane revelations. Some people should simply not take fantasy stories and pseudo-religious texts too seriously, thought the scientist dismissively. Cool and rational, he revised the scant results of his work. The writings mentioned a very ancient place called Lomar on a large icy and cold island named Hyperborea. According to the author of the lines, this Lomar should have been inhabited at least 10,000 years ago. A vigilant, stony, demonic god was also described. Then there was the depiction of a barren, icy windswept landscape. Webb, exhausted from 3 days of study in the light of the flickering gas lamp, rubbed his nose and concluded that he had only vague clues about a polar island with a distinctive rock formation. Overall, the document with its macabre hints reminded him of a spell book that should be believed only to a limited extent. Back in Princeton, after several days of abstinence from any antiquarian books, the professor concluded that it made sense to focus initially on Iceland, West Greenland, or some of the larger islands in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. He also had to always consider the university's funders, who could not be won over with too vague allusions or imprecise locations. The struggle for funds for an expedition was a cumbersome endeavor that Webb knew from experience. Several years ago, Professor William Channing Webb embarked on Arctic journeys, first as a young graduate and assistant, and later on self-led expeditions that took him primarily to the Inuit-inhabited northern regions of Canada, with its numerous islands and icy waterways. This relatively unexplored region, where the white spots on the map had only recently closed, was a treasure trove for the anthropologist. Animistic shamanism, drum dances, and, above all, the egalitarian social structure not only attracted Webb but also left a lasting impression on him. In tranquil moments, Webb internally lamented that the Inuit, who once hunted narwhals in their canoes, would likely succumb to alcohol, smallpox, or Christian missionaries within a few decades. Chapter 2, Captain Magnussen's Tale. The city of Salem in the state of Massachusetts, known for its witch trials, served as an excellent starting point for the polar expedition planned during the brief Arctic summer. The crucial harbor attracted whalers, merchant ships, and sailors of all kinds. Webb, relieved to have left the bureaucratic battles over funding behind, received a tip in a harbor office to seek out an experienced captain named Magnussen, who was currently unemployed with his steamship in the harbor. The older yet vigorous man introduced himself as Captain Magnussen, offering a firm handshake and a brief overview of his skills. As a former whaler, he possessed decades of experience in the Arctic. Having abandoned his previous profession due to the scarcity of whales, he now supplied provisions, tools, and passengers to remote locations in the Arctic Sea. After a toast with aquavit, Webb and the Danish shipowner and captain reached an agreement on payment. Webb entrusted Captain Magnussen with the task of making the Arctic journey aboard the seasoned and Arctic-capable steamship.
Forbandelse,
which translates to damnation in Danish. The journey to Iceland lasted almost 8 days, and after an unsuccessful attempt near Reykjavik to follow a lead provided by the expedition, Webb decided that this part of the journey was complete. Somewhat irritable due to this early setback, the professor became somewhat touchy in the following days. The next leg was Godthåb, West Greenland. During the crossing, the Danish captain shared with the professor an incident that might interest the American. On a quiet and dark night, The ships were manned by the first mate. The bearded sailor took some time for the scholar. With a good glass of aquavit, the captain welcomed his client into the captain's cabin. In somewhat halting English with a strong Scandinavian accent, the old seafarer recounted what he had learned years ago in a Copenhagen pub frequented by hardened Greenland voyagers, as he packed his pipe. Magnussen paused before continuing. Whether he was testing the professor's interest, organizing his thoughts, or reconsidering was not entirely apparent.
As you may know, there have been several Arctic expeditions, but one less known is that of the Scotsman Douglas Charles Clavering, who, in 1823, went to the east coast of Greenland, among other places.
Webb knew that it was the less populated coast of Greenland, and the only settlements worthy of mention, like Godthåb, were on the west side of the icy island. The captain ran his fingers through his thick beard and continued with what Clavering found on a coast off the Greenland mainland in August 1823.
The participants of that expedition encountered a group of 12 Inuit whose behavior and appearance markedly differed from the inhabitants of other Greenland regions. They seemed isolated from the outside world, practicing an unusual way of life and a peculiar cult. In the desolation of the most inhospitable place on earth, hundreds of sea miles from the nearest human soul, this small group of people lived and pursued their rights. Clavering noticed the absence of all modern objects or materials that could indicate even the most irregular trade relationship with other Inuit. In his diary, Clavering described their tent, canoe, clothing made of seal fur, harpoons, and spears made of bone and meteoric iron. He was amazed as these fascinating people demonstrated their skill with weapons for hunting. Clavering also observed the technically clever and perfectly adapted small canoes, their frames made of bone, covered with sealskin, lightweight, agile, and fast, ideal for the climate and needs. However, two more aspects were noted by the Scotsman in his diary, which were of a rather unusual nature. He and his crew couldn't shake the impression that the small group of islanders was putting on a show for the visitors and that the departure of the Europeans was better sooner than later wished. Normally, one would believe that such people yearn for contact with the outside world. An unanswered question concluded the brief diary entry.
If these people are not stranded here and, with some effort, could reach significantly more inhabitable areas using their canoes, what are they still doing here?
Professor Webb poured some aquavit for himself and Captain Magnussen as the sailor puffed on his pipe. The pleasant scent of spicy Orient tobacco of the finest quality filled the captain's cabin. Due to a lack of a better term or sheer disinterest, Europeans simply called this group of people Northeast Greenlanders, Magnussen remarked.
Another expedition in 1869-70 led by Captain Carl Coldway, the second German North Polar expedition, confirmed what his Scottish predecessor had observed in the surrounding region's emptiness. Even the small group of Inuit on the previously unnamed island had disappeared. They found some remnants of their settlement and named the island after its European first discoverer.
Professor Webb grumbled that they could have at least asked the indigenous people back then what they called themselves before, in colonial arrogance, naming their places after themselves. The Dane, slightly annoyed and nodding, puffed on his pipe, and Webb continued, with a slightly disappointed tone he couldn't conceal.
An interesting little story, but
I wasn't finished yet,
grumbled the sailor, launching into the second part of his tale.
What I've told you, esteemed professor, is the official version, what anyone who takes the trouble to delve into the archives can read and research.
Is that so?
Asked the curious professor.
Is there another version of events? Don't take it amiss if I sound somewhat disappointed, but there are numerous stories of the abandonment of settlements in Greenland. Just think of the disappearance of the Scandinavian settlers, the Greenlandinger, during the 15th century. The climate in Greenland is harsh and unforgiving. The indigenous people of Greenland, the Kalaaleet, earn great respect from me for not only surviving in this place but also expanding. Where the descendants of Eric the Red had to yield, they thrive.
Who are you telling that to? Without modern technology and a lot of effort, the two of us wouldn't survive a week here.
Magnussen noted.
But back to my remark. Yes, there is another version of the story I told you. In that same dive bar in the port of Copenhagen that I mentioned earlier, I met a former member of the second expedition. His account of the events deviated significantly from the records of the expedition leader and left me with insights I would have happily done without in hindsight. Fritz was his name, if I recall correctly. The poor German lad told me with horror what he experienced under the leadership of Captain Carl Coldway back then. Even several mugs of potent Danish strong beer couldn't lift the darkness from the guy's expression. They sailed north along the east coast of Greenland to explore and map the region and the Arctic Ocean. Nothing noteworthy happened until the day the two ships anchored off the island later named Clavering Island by Coldway. The island, roughly 1,500 square kilometers in size, 58 kilometers long, and 40 kilometers wide, with several elevations, the highest reaching almost 1,600 m, offered nothing extraordinary that set it apart from other similar polar islands. Fritz still remembered all this and a few geographic details that I'll spare you at this point, Professor. The young Fritz, who looked much older than his age, took a hearty gulp and began to reveal the interesting part. They landed with rowboats and ventured into the desolate Arctic interior of this cold desert, which had little vegetation. After a few kilometers away from the coast, the men were drawn to a collection of unusually white objects in the distance, which turned out to be an absurdly large quantity of bleached bones. Upon reaching the site of these remnants, they found simple structures made of unprocessed rocks. Around the small settlement lay countless partially fresh bones of whales, musk oxen, walruses, snow hares, foxes, and so on. Fritz emphasized the vast amounts of bones that covered the ground, reminiscent of a slaughterhouse. Then they encountered the creators of the scene, a small group of men, women, and children. The number might have been about a dozen, similar to what Clavering found in 1823. The number seemed to remain stable, which was surprising given the living conditions and the relentless Arctic winter. They were undoubtedly Inuit of the original kind with little contact with the outside world, a description the simple German sailor could provide even without studying anthropology.
Professor Webb snorted somewhat disdainfully at this jab against his field. A mischievous grin had spread across the face of the Danish seafarer.
Fritz could not only confirm the assumptions and descriptions of the 1823 expedition to Magnussen but added a few eerie details. These details were censored by Fritz's superiors, and all participants in the expedition had to swear to keep silent about what followed.
Wait a minute,
exclaimed the professor.
According to the records of the second expedition, wasn't the small group of people long gone?
Correct. But that's not the truly strange part,
replied Magnussen.
Fritz mentioned that the group was led by a shaman named Kunik. Together, they worshipped an extraordinary stone relief of their sleeping god, carved into the granite base of a nearby mountain.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but how could these people carve a stone relief into a rock? I am aware that indigenous people are capable of fantastic artistic representations. However, the technical execution requires at least something like good metal tools. Artistic talent aside, that seems like a technical impossibility, and...
Who says the Inuit created the relief? But I'll get to that later,
replied the smoking Magnussen. The professor, now temporarily silenced, leaned back in his comfortable chair after his interrupted speech, taking a sip of schnapps to let the smoking captain continue his tale.
As in much of Greenland today, the dominant belief is not Christianity but animistic religions that enrich animals, plants, things with human-like souls and know a whole world of spirit beings. In areas strongly influenced by trading Europeans or in their settlements, of course, things look very different. First comes the so-called discoverer, then the trader, then the colonial official, and then the priest. First, they take away their own names, then the economic foundations, then autonomy, and finally, they erase the last remnants of their culture. Unfortunately, a crime observed in many places committed by so-called civilized nations.
Mused the well-traveled Dane cynically, and his American conversation partner nodded, ashamed and in agreement.
Back to Fritz and Koenig. The latter stared deep into my eyes in the smoky bar, checking if I still took him seriously, and continued. They could only communicate to some extent with the sealskin-clad, rather emaciated figures with the help of a local call-outlet. He constantly insisted that they should leave quickly, return to the ships, and leave this island and its inhabitants to themselves as much as possible while they still could. He had heard terrible rumors about such people, but he refused to elaborate. The expedition leader at the time insisted on inspecting the mentioned relief, but Koenig denied him and said it was taboo for outsiders. The principled Koenig rejected a few offered knives, scissors, and useless trinkets, insisting on his position. There stood a emaciated, 1.6 tall, fur-clad old man with his coppery, dark skin, round face, and black hair facing the educated, tall German polar explorer, who held a doctorate in mathematics, physics, and astronomy, trying to resist the explorer's undignified attempts at bribery. Duped and ashamed due to his own incompetence, the expedition leader couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed the old shaman and, threatening violence and torture, forced him to reveal the location of the relief. Koenig disdainfully nodded toward a dark mountainous massif, indicating the path for the research group. The remaining islanders were conspicuously apathetic, almost expectant. They let go of Koenig and set out, leaving the settlement's inhabitants staring accusingly after the strangers heading toward their sanctuary. About 3 kilometers through the bone-dry cold desert, which, like its scorching hot relatives in the subtropics, allowed barely any life, they reached the rock that promised the desired object. The search took some time until a crew member screamed to the others with a voice breaking.
Well, one almost automatically thinks of the fate of the Irminsul of the Saxons,
warned the professor with a sinister premonition.
Don't worry,
reassured the captain.
The expedition will not destroy the relief, as Charlemagne did with the sanctuary of the so-called heathens. Instead, the group of seasoned and partly highly educated men stood with open mouths before the colossal rockwork that seemed to have emerged from a nightmare. Now, the descriptive abilities of our brave sailor in the Copenhagen harbor pub were threatened by the consumption of too much beer. Fritz couldn't provide any further detailed description of what he saw. Perhaps he couldn't or didn't want to. He only noted that the group made a hasty and panicked retreat toward the rowboats. There was no trace of the islanders. Only a disturbing howl and shouting could be heard from a distance. The sound was something like this. Cthulhu! Cthulhu! Cthulhu!
Then the head of the thoroughly intoxicated Fritz slid onto the counter, and Magnussen knew that the conversation was over. Chapter 3, Horror on the High Seas. Webb rose, stretched wearily, and yawned loudly, thanking for the schnapps and the excellent sailor's yarn the cunning old seaman had spun for him. Then he marched somewhat unsteadily to his cabin, hearing the Danish sailor grumbling behind him, shouting
no sailor's yarn about it.
After him. In his bunk, he pondered over the strange stuff he had just been told. A William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology, could not be taken for a ride. He was a man of science, of reason. He looked at the wall of his sparse accommodation and saw a prepared shark jaw. Webb recalled having read something about this species. A shark known as the Greenlander sleeper shark, up to 5 meters long, living beneath the sea ice of the Arctic and not hesitating to devour seals and polar bears. He realized that there were things in the ocean beneath the boat he was currently on that he might not want to know too precisely. Whether it was the alcohol, the headaches that had been plaguing the professor for quite some time, or the talk of eerie people on lonely islands and secret cults, the professor's sleep tonight would certainly not be dreamless. The metallic echoing sound, heard at regular intervals, woke up the professor. It was as if someone were hitting one of the metal walls of the ship with a hammer. The heavy head made orientation difficult, and the light had gone out. He groped for a clumsy old whale oil lamp, the use of which spread an unpleasant smell of fat and oil. Igniting it proved to be a bit challenging for the still not completely sober scholar. The sea had become noticeably rougher, and the muffled whistling of a roaring storm now reached Webb's ears. However, it was not just the alcohol but also the swaying forbandals that made simple progress difficult for any seaman. With the flickering lamp in one hand and the other always careful to hold onto something or brace himself, Webb made his way. His goal was clear the bridge. The light in the corridors had gone out, and where was the crew? Probably in the engine rooms and on the bridge, where they were most needed. What did an anthropologist know about seafaring? He could barely distinguish port from starboard, thought Webb as he stepped over one rolling object after another, fallen from tables or cabinets. As he ascended the short metal staircase to the ship's bridge and entered, something entirely unexpected struck him: abandonment. There was no one to be seen or heard for miles.
Captain Magnussen! Captain Magnussen! Captain Magnussen!
Shouted the American, attempting to drown out the raging storm. It raged with unrelenting force, and large amounts of water, driven by the wind, repeatedly splashed against the outer windows. A glance out of those windows filled the landlubber, who had never experienced such rough seas, with panic. The ship danced like a cork up and down, and the bow plunged into the large waves of the dark night. The ship's position was still stable, as it was perpendicular to the sea. However, without a helmsman and crew, that could quickly change. In his mind's eye, William Channing Webb saw his own corpse sinking to the bottom of the sea, to be devoured there by that very Greenland shark whose jaw he had been contemplating earlier. The chances of survival in these waves and temperatures are zero, Webb fantasized. He would probably not even drown or die from hypothermia, but from the shock of the cold salt water. Enough with these doomsday scenarios. Where was that damn old goat of a captain or his crew? Were they already on some lifeboats, leaving him alone here? But further theories and curses were abruptly halted for the professor. Suddenly, the vessel came to a stop in the middle of a massive wave, and Webb was immediately knocked off his feet. The loud clattering and banging of numerous belongings echoed throughout the ship, which now definitively landed on the floor. Webb quickly picked himself up and strangely felt relieved that the ship was no longer swaying. Just like that, without reason, the sea was still rough and stormy. How this came about increasingly worried the scientist unfamiliar with seafaring. And because of his pain caused by the fall, he had severely cut his left forearm on a sharp-edged metal bolt. He wanted to investigate the cause of the stop. He turned to the large windows of the bridge, which offered an excellent view of the bow for a helmsman. What he saw there, he could not believe at first. The bow was literally stuck in the water. The ship had been partially lifted from the water in the trough of the wave. Not just for a brief moment, but permanently. It was floating, levitating. Perhaps the vessel had run onto a structure? One of those rocks in the middle of the ocean inhabited by boobies and puffins could be the cause. Such bad luck doesn't exist. In the middle of the endless ocean, and we run aground on a tiny rock in the middle of nowhere. But he quickly dismissed the thought. He still had the Danish captain's words in his ear, speaking of the endless depths of the Irminger Sea, which likely made this part of the North Atlantic about 2,500 meters deep. Topographic details he had picked up disinterestedly when leaving Iceland. The otherwise composed university scholar's nerves began to show distinct cracks. Holding his bleeding forearm, he gazed toward the bow, struggling to discern anything. The night, the wind, the foaming sea, and the waves crashing against the windows made an observation of the ship's bow moderately difficult. Yet, he thought he could make out some movement. Something clung to the ship, something large. Or, more precisely, something held the ship and was likely the cause of the sudden halt. Webb made a serpentine motion in the stormy nocturnal twilight, which seemed not to be the only one of its kind. Fear gripped him. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating what glistened wetly from the bow over the forward deck to the superstructures. In the dark, almost indistinguishable amid the heavy seas, he now saw several tentacles, each as thick as tree trunks, slithering over the partially flooded deck. In a paralyzed shock, Webb stood with his mouth agape before the window, incapable of action. Then, he heard a slapping and squeaking sound against one of the windows. One of the suction cup-covered tentacles clung to the bridge's windows, and it wouldn't be the only one. The monstrous tentacles then breached the last barrier and seized the Professor Webb, who was screaming for his life. Chapter 4, Decision in Godthåb. With a heavy head and a dry mouth, the sweat-drenched Webb awoke in his bunk. Gripped by what he had just experienced, he looked around frantically and, with relief, realized it was just a nightmare. The potent aquavit and the cursed sea tales from the old seafarer had undoubtedly thrown him off balance. Captain Magnussen knocked on the door, inquiring if everything was all right. They had heard screams. An undescribed nightmare was offered as an explanation, and the captain teased about sea spirits and giant octopuses. A shiver ran down the professor's spine. Before having breakfast, Webb wanted to at least freshen up a bit to avoid looking completely disheveled. While lathering his stubble with shaving soap, due to the cramped conditions, he bumped his left forearm against the open cabin door. A sharp pain shot through his arm, and then he noticed the large spot of partially dried blood on his shirt. The further journey to West Greenland was uneventful, and they finally anchored off the largest settlement in the country, Godthåb. Founded by the Danish missionary Hans Egede in 1728, it was the most important trading post, seat of the Danish colonial government, and the Danish Lutheran Church. The city was not only the main port for trade between Greenland and Denmark but also promised information, guides, and interpreters for polar explorers. After the setback in Iceland, the expedition had come to West Greenland to follow up on leads that were not much more promising. Webb considered ending the entire journey and boarding a ship to New England. The funds provided by the university didn't have to be fully utilized if there was simply nothing to explore. And so he strolled along the unpaved rocky paths of the 1,100 inhabitants counting town, exploring the few sights, small coastal villages, almost deserted landscapes, and an occasionally deceptive beauty characterized Greenland for the polar explorer. Try as he might, he couldn't forget the nightmare, especially Magnussen's story. If there was any truth to the horror tale, William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology, should actually be excited about this godforsaken island with its shaman Canuck and the mysterious relief. He wanted to discuss the decision with the captain of the Forbandals, as he could refuse at any time. So the captain and the expedition leader sat on a lonely bench, overlooking the beautiful fjord landscape that was characteristic of this region. With a good aquavit, Webb got straight to the point.
What if I wanted to change my expedition goals and, instead of West Greenland, now have an interest in the East Coast?
You must be joking.
The Dane chuckled and almost choked.
We would have to go around Cape Farewell all over again. When the Forbandals is at full steam, we can make 10 to 15 knots per hour in light seas. Which exact place are you considering, Professor?
Webb gathered himself and blurted out.
Your damned island from the story you told me.
Magnussen held his belly from laughter and then looked somewhat incredulous when he realized that Webb was serious.
My good sir, that's a whole 1,600 nautical miles. The one-way journey alone takes at least a full week if everything goes smoothly, and in the Arctic, it almost never does.
Would you do it?
Sure. It's all a matter of money.
Chuckled the bearded old captain mischievously.
But we can't set sail for 3 days. The bow of the Forbandals suffered unnoticed damage on the journey from Iceland here. Odd, one would think something bit into it with a beak and damaged the metal.
Webb took a very large sip of aquavit. Chapter 5, The Greenlander. Upon arriving in Greenland, inhabited by the Inuit, Webb realized that he needed an interpreter for the spoken Greenlandic, known as Kalalasut. Magnussen advised Webb to inquire with the local Danish colonial officer. In somewhat difficult to understand English, the officer gave a hint about a young man named Ariarnak Olsen. Webb knocked on the door of Ariarnak's residence, a typical Scandinavian wooden house with a red coating. A young man with open features opened the door and asked about the purpose of the visit. Webb mentioned something about a polar expedition and the need for an interpreter, and the host kindly invited the American inside.
Let me be brief, as my Danish is probably worse than your English. I need a Kalalasut translator to enable me to communicate verbally with the locals.
The Greenlander, who appeared to be of Inuit Scandinavian descent, replied in fairly flawless English.
This, sir, should not be a problem, as long as the journey does not last too long and does not exceed 80 degrees north latitude. I have no intention of ending up like the foolish Brits of 1845. Furthermore, I expect appropriate compensation.
Webb considered himself a fairly open-minded person but caught himself feeling somewhat surprised by the good pronunciation and educational level of this Greenlander living in the wilderness. Even a 19th-century professor of anthropology would likely first notice the small stature, almond-shaped eyes, dark long hair, and copper-colored skin that characterized Ariarnak and might find it hard to resist certain stereotypes. Yet, Ariarnak promptly shattered them. The next morning, the Greenlander stood on board the Forbandals and was introduced to the captain. The captain warmly shook the offered hand, and Webb was relieved that a hurdle for his expedition had been overcome. Magnussen announced that the damages to the bow had been repaired, and they could set sail. He rang the ship's bell, and the Forbandals steamed its way towards Clavering Island. Webb avoided disclosing detailed information to his interpreter, even though the expedition seemed rather indifferent to him. One night, unable to sleep, Webb stepped onto the deck and found the Greenlander leaning against the railing. The young man looked melancholically into the distance and turned around in surprise when he noticed the professor.
You can't sleep either?
Webb replied.
I've been having pretty bad nightmares lately.
Dreams are just froth, so they say.
Joked the Greenlander. Not when your arm is bleeding, and the damn bow has bite marks from who knows what, thought the American through gritted teeth.
The captain told me we're heading to the east coast. I'm not sure if my language skills will even come into play there. Hardly anyone lives there.
We're going to Clavering Island.
Ariarnak smirked, shook his head, and turned to the icy ocean.
There, you'll find only ice, rocks, and, if you're not careful, death.
Chapter 6, Clavering Island. After a good week of travel, the Forbandals pushed powerfully, snorting through the gale hamp bugged, covered with a few small ice floes. Clavering Island didn't make a particular impression from a distance. It reflected the typical landscape: untouched wilderness, icy silence, glaciers flowing into the sea, sparse flora and fauna, and snow-covered mountains dominating the island's interior. It was decided that it was best to anchor initially in the Godthåb Gulf south of Clavering Island. The remaining day was spent preparing for the landing the next day. Webb was almost giddy, as if he couldn't wait to find the eerie Canuck, his ghostly entourage, and, above all, the hideous idol. Maybe all for nothing, but not for me, thought the cunning captain in the meantime. He had told the naive American a tall tale that a drunkard had told him years ago, and now he found himself in the middle of nowhere with his furbandals. As long as the money was right. The captain nodded contentedly and grinned, disappearing for aquavit in his cabin. Early in the morning, Magnussen took over the watch and relieved his first mate on the bridge.
Anything to report? Was the night quiet?
The captain asked his first mate. The man hesitated, and the captain didn't like that at all, demanding sternly to report everything relevant. The captain's representative rubbed his neck, avoided eye contact, and said,
"Well, there was something."
What was it?
Magnussen asked forcefully.
A strange noise, a horrible scream or howl came from the island.
Perhaps the last great auk or just the whistling Arctic wind. Did you sweeten the night watch with some strong alcohol?
Barked the Dane against his calm nature. The officer swore on his honor that it wasn't so, and the captain decided not to pursue the matter further. The blood-red morning glow of a weak sun rising in the east of the dark blue, almost black Arctic Ocean announced the beginning of a new day. Webb wanted to make the most of it until the last sunshine and urged the small group, consisting of Captain Magnussen, 2 Danish sailors, the translator Ariarnak, and of course himself, to set off quickly. The dinghy, a large wooden rowboat, was launched, while the first mate and the stoker were to guard the furbandals as it continued to anchor off the island. The calm, smooth sea and the color spectacle presented by the rising sun filled the researcher with optimism, and the prospect of groundbreaking discoveries invigorated him. The 2 strong, rough sailors took to the oars and rowed the vessel toward a small headland that protruded into the bay. After half an hour, they landed on a narrow beach consisting of multicolored granite pebbles and secured the boat. With simple luggage, Webb wisely refrained from sleds or dogs, as large parts of the island were snow-free at this time. They set off on the path into the island's interior. The 2 Danish sailors spoke to each other in their native language, and when Webb asked, Ariarnak, whose Danish was flawless, translated that the 2 regretted not bringing a firearm.
"Hvorfor? Why?"
asked Webb, showing off his bits of Danish. Before anyone could answer, the expedition leader spoke.
The wolves are so rare here due to the limited food supply that it would be a miracle to encounter them. Besides, they are by no means as dangerous as some horror stories tell.
The sailors just shook their heads, and after the professor appealed to their courage, they continued. They now reached the edge of the narrow and sparse vegetation zone, which housed only a few lichens, mosses, and scanty grasses, entering the lifeless cold desert. The group trudged through the brown sand and now had to accept an incline leading to the upper edge of the hill range that encompassed the valley from Magnussen's story. Arriving at the edge of the high barren hills, the men were met with a desolate and wide view. The clear visibility revealed a basin that lacked any distinctive landmarks. The monotony of the dead brown rock made the researcher's heart heavier, and his optimism took a first blow. The only interesting landmark that stood out was an inconspicuous granite rock formation that Webb suspected might be the place where the enchanted settlement of the islanders could be.
You do realize that European explorations before 1823 found numerous pieces of evidence for a past presence of the Inuit in northeast Greenland but never the people themselves,
remarked Ariarnak, who now knew the purpose of the journey.
Except for this island.
Webb replied, suddenly stumbling.
Hell!
Shouted the increasingly irritated professor. Something had almost caused him to fall. Something white protruding from the dusty ground. A huge bone, mostly buried in the gravel.
That's a whale vertebra,
declared the former whaler Magnussen without hesitation. All stared at each other somewhat bewildered and questioning. They reached the granite rock formation in the middle of the valley and noticed that the vertebra over which the professor had stumbled was by no means the only one of its kind. At first, Webb mistook what he saw from a distance for a few scattered remnants of snow resisting the short summer sun. However, the rock formation was surrounded by accumulations of numerous bones, bleached snow-white by erosion, the Greenlandic sun, and the merciless temperatures. And so, the five men stood lost and speechless in this morbid scene, gazing at the remains of whales, seals, walruses, musk oxen, Arctic foxes, snow hares, and various small animals. The two sailors broke the silence and wanted to return to the beach. However, a firm word from the captain prevented that promptly. They were only the remains of a slaughter site of an extinct group of Inuit.
It is not certain that these people are extinct,
corrected Webb. Magnussen rolled his eyes and sighed.
Ikke uddød.
Came immediately horrified from one of the sailors. Magnussen had probably only told the sailors about a little hike on an uninhabited island, knowing about their superstitious nature. And now, in the midst of a vast graveyard of Arctic fauna, they were revealed that they might encounter the culprits responsible for it. They seemed to be afraid of ending up like the bones of the animals. The other sailor, meanwhile, started muttering some obscenities in his native language. Before the argument escalated, a shout from Ariarnok interrupted the scene. He had found the dwellings of the islanders. Chapter 7, Events of Madness. The two of the total of 5 still relatively intact dwellings were dug into the ground, surrounded by uncut stones. The whole setup was covered with whale bones, driftwood, and animal hides. The weathered condition of the hides and the completely deteriorated remaining accommodations suggested that the dwellings had been abandoned for some time. There were no tools, harpoons, sleds, or clothing needed for survival in these latitudes. The sailors wanted to turn back immediately. Webb wanted to search for the rock relief, and the rest of the group, with shrugged shoulders, reluctantly joined the leader. So, the two sailors had to unwillingly and shaking their heads comply with the will of the majority and the order of their captain. Since Webb lacked any precise description of the way to the relief, he arbitrarily decided to examine the nearest rock formation of the surrounding mountain range, which partially enclosed the valley.
Rationerne rækker kun til 3 dage.
Immediately came as an objection from one of the unwilling.
That the rations only last for 3 days doesn't matter, you just have to ration, then you can extend the excursion to 5 days,
retorted the increasingly irritated Webb. The two sailors exchanged silent, meaningful glances.
Did you notice at the slaughter site that the bones of the marine mammals and musk oxen are much older and more weathered than those of the smaller animals?
Asked Magnussen, who wanted to lighten the mood.
No, I didn't pay attention to that,
replied Webb as the two walked side by side towards the mountain massif. The rest of the group followed the pair.
Almost as if the Northeast Greenlandic group decimated the local stocks of marine mammals and musk oxen so much that they became locally extinct. I always thought these peoples live in harmony with.
Ariarnok, who had overheard the conversation, interrupted the former whaler abruptly.
We didn't bring the stocks to the brink of extinction, you did with your damn greed for whale oil.
The paused pair was overtaken by the Greenlander, who threw a disdainful glance at the captain. He wouldn't say another word for the rest of the day. Upon reaching the ascending dark basalt of the mountain range, Webb had the group rest briefly before starting the search for unusual formations. The whole thing took the rest of the day and yielded no results.
We may have roughly examined 1/10 of the possible hills and mountains that could be considered for the ominous relief,
said the captain in front of the gas stove, which was heating tea and dry food.
We continue anyway. I pay you and your men for their services, not for inventing excuses.
With a somber mood, everyone, except for one sailor who was to keep watch, settled into their sleeping bags. Tents were foolishly omitted to save weight, even though temperatures, even in the summer, were slightly above 6 degrees Celsius during the day and far below freezing at night. Professor Webb, whose clothing and sleeping bag could barely fend off the cold, woke up shivering in the middle of the night and was blinded by a spectacle. The night sky above him was illuminated by the glowing and iridescent colors of the aurora borealis, the so-called northern or polar lights. The stars in the firmament were adorned with green, red, and violet color veils. Webb could hardly tear his eyes away and forgot about the cold for a moment. Then he turned slightly to the side and made a strange observation in the distance of the valley. On the other side of the basin, a glow seemed to be reflected from the rock walls. It was not the aurora borealis, it was a large fire. The American squinted his eyes and assured himself that he wasn't hallucinating. He jumped out of his sleeping bag and wanted to go to the watch. However, the young sailor who had volunteered the night before was gone. Webb, now completely agitated, woke the other 3 men, who peeled themselves out of their sleeping bags in a daze. Captain Magnussen was in mild panic over his missing crew member. The professor, on the other hand, spurred on by the fire in the distance. Captain Magnussen voiced what everyone was thinking.
Who lit the fire, and where is the sailor?
The expedition leader tried to calm the situation by suggesting that the sailor might have tried to make his way to the beach on his own. The captain dismissed the professor's thought with a wave of his hand, saying,
My men don't desert. Besides, the way to the rowboat is in the opposite direction.
It was decided, due to the darkness and dangerous terrain, to wait until the next morning to search for the missing man. The weak polar sun brought an unpleasant surprise fog. Although they only had to cross the shallow valley, the 4 men found it difficult to find their way toward the fire they had observed during the night. They stayed close together to avoid losing another member of the expedition. A good 3 hours later, and the fog still obscured their clear view, they approached the targeted spot. The captain took out a small pocket compass whose needle was spinning wildly.
Either it's stormy, snowy, freezing cold, foggy like in London, and now.
Magnussen was touched on the arm by the Greenlander, who pointed with an outstretched arm at something in the foggy distance.
What is that?
Webb asked in horror. In the misty haze, about 200 yards away, the searching group could discern something resembling a human figure. The searching group approached the figure silently, anxiously, and cautiously. As they got closer, it became more apparent that the person was indeed human. The person, facing away from them, knelt on the ground and remained motionless. Naked and smeared with something, the scene looked inhospitable and surreal, sending a tremendous shock to everyone. Yet, no one wanted to appear cowardly in front of the others, so they pressed on. The captain finally mustered the courage when he recognized the missing man. He touched the sailor's shoulder with one hand and asked in a reassuring voice,
Lad, vad skied der?
The missing man didn't respond and just stared blankly ahead. He was covered from head to toe in a blue-green liquid, with a consistency resembling blood. His mouth was also completely smeared, as if he had bitten into something with that same fluid. While Magnussen lifted the young man and wrapped his jacket around him to prevent further cooling, Webb noticed something strange in the direction the sailor had been staring so intently. Something undefinable, with unusual outlines, lay in the fog on the rocky ground. A trail of slimy blue-green liquid led him to the object about 20 meters away. As he approached, he he made an inexplicable discovery. The American scholar was greatly startled when a lying eye on the ground stared directly at him. It had a dark iris and a lens but no cornea, and it measured 25 centimeters in diameter. Blood vessels and pale tissue clung to the mentioned eye, which now made the doctor doubt his sanity. He called the Greenlander, who, full of horror, only uttered one word.
A Marsac.
The captain, now alarmed, joined them and also uttered only one word.
Kraken. These are the remains of a giant squid, a cephalopod up to 12 meters long, living in the infinite depths of the ocean and sometimes washed ashore,
explained the well-traveled sailor.
Is such a thing possible? It sounds like a sailor's yarn, if...
The captain interrupted the professor, now also at the end of his nerves, brusquely.
It lies before you. How can you accuse me of sailor's yarn?
The captain turned away from the couple, shaking his head, and went to the found sailor, who was being cared for by his sailor companion. He remained unresponsive but allowed everything to be done to him. Furtively but distinctly, the Greenlander commented.
Listen, Professor. This is not just any gigantic deep-sea cephalopod, this is one of the offspring of a Marsac, a dangerous creature lurking in the waters of Greenland, threatening sailors and seafarers.
Webb touched his still not completely healed forearm. Everyone was apparently starting to lose their minds. Chapter 8, Discovery of the Nightmare.
Perhaps he ate raw squid. The blue-green liquid is the blood of this group of animals.
The captain spoke when everyone was reunited.
What is your sailor doing here? Why are the remains of a huge deep-sea monster inland on this island? Where is the fire? And above all, where is the relief?
The professor asked the group.
The expedition has failed. I will not allow anyone else to die here. We march straight toward the rowboats and then back to the Forbandals.
The captain shouted at the professor, who still had his relief in mind. Webb began to counter, reconsidered, shrugged his shoulders, and reluctantly nodded with a pained expression. Following the rock walls, they made their way toward the beach. The remains of the squid carcass were left behind, and the fire from the previous night was no longer a concern. After a few hundred meters, Webb noticed something strange on the ground. He asked for a brief pause to investigate, but the captain insisted on continuing the journey. In the brown sand, another bleached whale bone, part of the lower jaw, as the captain noted, eerily protruded from the fog. But this bone was just the beginning. A whole cemetery of arranged whale bones lay before them. In the twilight of the mist, ribs were thrust into the sand, and vertebrae were arranged in circles. The professor forgot all fear and doubt. He finally saw the end of his search. This had to be a ritual site of the Northeast Greenlanders.
We must go on. The fog is thickening, and Lasse needs to get indoors.
Magnussen called out. The professor ignored the old captain and feverishly looked around, searching for something in the misty outlines of basalt rock walls and granite boulders that could be a relief. However, he found no clues quickly. When the captain tried to urge the group to continue, the sailor found earlier, named Lasse, resisted the order and calmly walked without difficulty to a rock niche, disappearing behind it. The overlapping basalt rock walls provided a passage to a small secluded part of the valley, which remained hidden from a casual glance from a distance. The second sailor followed his comrades, only to come out screaming madly. The three remaining men looked at each other and ran towards the niche to pass through it. At first, they didn't notice the cause of the fear, but then, in the fog before them, was what the professor had been searching for all along. resembling the famous Buddha statues of Bamiyan, Afghanistan, a creature about 20 meters tall, carved into the dark basalt rock, stood before them, a being none of them had ever seen or associated with anything. It appeared as a tentacled-faced monster with wings, a blend of cephalopod, reptile, and monster. It stood upright, seemingly blessing the observers with a liturgical gesture resembling that of a church leader. The professor stood there with his mouth agape. The Greenlander stared in disbelief, repeatedly uttering the words,
A marsac, a marsac, a marsac.
Magnussen quickly regained control, and the practical sailor called the name of the half-naked sailor into the fog several times, as he had escaped. The torn sailor was seen debating which of his crew members to pursue. However, the decision was quickly taken from him as, not too far away, a horrendous screaming and howling was heard, with the chant echoing.
The Northeast Greenlanders,
exclaimed the professor.
A marsac,
replied Ariarnok.
That's not Lassie. Regardless of whoever or whatever is screaming in the fog, we need to get to the beach,
remarked Magnussen. And so, all three hastily slipped through the niche and ran towards the presumed beach. Kicking up dust, the three gasped for breath as they sprinted for their lives. Now, even the professor, shaken to his core, had forgotten about his studies. He just wanted to save his skin. The group was completely out of breath as they crossed the low ridge, and the beach came into view. The sailor who had fled screaming earlier had already launched the rowboat and waved frantically at the three men. The three shouted exhaustedly,
Wait, Vint!
But the sailor waved more energetically, pointing behind them. However, he wasn't pointing at them but behind them. A bone harpoon whizzed past the captain's head from behind, narrowly missing him. They reached the water and leapt into the boats the sailor and Ariarnok rowed for their lives. Webb was the first to muster the courage to glance back at the now shrinking beach. In the fog, he heard nothing except for the accursed chant. Late realization. St. Louis 1925, 48 years later. The professor, now a respected scholar of name and rank, attended the annual meeting of the American Archaeological Society. He met with his fellow colleagues and a few unrelated guests in an atmosphere of anticipation. An inspector named Legrassa interrupted the conversations and asked all the gathered scholars for help. He had something and couldn't make sense of it, but he hoped to get clues from the assembly. And so, he placed the hideous thing he had taken from a cult in the swamps of Louisiana, on the table. A figure crouching on a pedestal, made of a greenish stone. Tentacles hung from the monster's face, and the wings and claws of the depicted creature, armed with malevolence, triggered, with the tobacco smoke that filled the room, the professor's traumatic memories. His vision almost went black, but then the now elderly man gathered his courage and began to tell his story.